Thank you. I'm just going to say a few words. My name's Jane Tyrrell. I'm from the office here at Hume Gibbons College, and Arlene works closely with me. She does a lot of our live online training. So if you've done some of that, you've probably met her before. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to come find out more about the Hume Gibbons Diploma and whether it's for you. It's a very popular course. We find people get an awful lot out of it. And they're able to go off and do all sorts of different things with it. It's not just psychotherapy and counselling. The skills are widely applicable for all sorts of things. People take it into coaching, emergency services, mental and physical healthcare as well. But I'm sure we'll get on to a little bit more of that later on. And as Arlene says, we're really delighted. We've got both diploma tutors here this evening. Gareth Hughes is our educational director for the college, and he's got a wealth of experience, not only as a practicing therapist, but in working in universities and mental health care, and also in how we learn, a real expert in the best ways to actually help people learn, retain knowledge and so forth. So he'll probably touch on that too. And Joe Baker likewise has a lot of practical experience as a therapist, and also a lot of educational experience in teaching, training and so forth. So I'm sure they're going to tell us a little bit about how they both got involved with the Hume Gibbons approach quite a few years ago. So it'd be lovely if I can hand over to you both, and you could perhaps start with a few words about how you came across the Hume Gibbons approach yourself and what attracted you to it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. And good evening, everyone. And thank you all for being with us this evening. It's lovely to see quite so many people. So yeah, we'll begin by talking a little bit about where we've kind of come from and how we both got involved in all of this. As we go through the session today, please do post your questions in the chat. We will, as I said, try and get to as many of those as possible. We want to make sure we're answering your questions this evening as best we possibly can. And we will we'll break at various points through our presentation just to pick up with those questions as we're going along, so we won't just take them all at the end. But for me, so as Jane said, my name is Dr. Gareth Hughes. I am a Hume Gibbons psychotherapist, and I kind of, like many people, fell into this by accident, really. I was originally working in halls of residence and had been given responsibility for looking after the well-being of students who were living in university accommodation, and thought I ought to get some training. And a colleague pointed me towards the Hume Gibbons brochure, as it was then. And I went along to one or two courses, really enjoyed it, then did a few more, and gradually it built and built and built. And over that time, I kind of decided, actually, this is what I want to do. I want to become a Hume Gibbons therapist. And I remember being just, every day that I went to it, being so excited and feeling a little bit like my brain was exploding as I learned new things. And I rethought the way that I viewed the world and mental health and how we work with each other. And then from there, I qualified. I'll look at Jo because she always remembers when it was that we qualified together, but 2012, I think.
2011.
2011, there you go, see. From there, I worked as a psychotherapist, working mainly in the university sector, working one-to-one with students. And that kind of got me interested in what was going on with student mental health. And so I kind of began to creep into research and trying to understand more about teaching and learning and what was going on in relationship between teaching and learning and student mental health. And that gradually then built into me taking more of a research profile and more of a kind of work nationally. I was the lead author of something called the University Mental Health Charter, and I've helped design websites and written books and things like that, all really focused around mental health in universities. And then a few years ago during the pandemic, came back into the college to take on working on the diploma and to become the educational director, which is a privilege and a pleasure. And I think Jo and I would both say we do lots of other things, but teaching the diploma is by far and away our favorite thing to do. So I'll hand over to Jo to tell us how your journey through.
Thanks, Gareth. So my journey was totally not within the therapeutic practice to start with. When I left school, I actually trained as a chef, and I worked as a pastry chef for a number of years until I was called into the family business and kind of sort of shimmied into accountancy, which I then did for a number of years. And I had two children and decided I didn't really want to carry on doing what I was doing. So I went to my local college and I trained as a person-centered counsellor. Took that journey, and then whilst on that journey actually discovered Hume Gibbons as well. And like Gareth, you know, my brain just exploded. I was just thought it was absolutely incredible, some of the ideas that were coming out of it at that time. So I decided to then train with human givens as well, and I did it like Gareth. Really, we did it over quite a while, because, you know, we were both working, got young children and things. So and I found that really worked for me, because I was able to embed the learning, you know, much better in that way for me personally. So we then did the part 2 of our diploma in 2011, and following that, I set up in private practice, and I worked a lot with the business sector, because that was where I was comfortable. And then after a few years, I went and joined Gareth at the university, where we worked both delivering therapy within the student wellbeing service, but also within a psychoeducation team that Gareth developed it, and I sort of took over the running of it, and the admin side, and expanded the reach of that. So we taught a lot of human givens based psychoeducation across the university, across all programs, to students and to staff. And a lot of that work gained national recognition, and then developed into the other projects that Gareth's already mentioned. And now I work obviously with the Human Givens College as a tutor on the part 1, part 2 and part 3, and also as co-head of supervision as well. And it's just been such an exciting journey, really, while still working in the higher education sector as well, in doing some therapy and supervision, and also some consultancy. So it's quite varied. Doing the HG Diploma and the qualification really opened up so many doors for me, in terms of, because it was so transferable, and I was able to take that into lots of different arenas.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. And I think that's one of the key things we'll perhaps talk about through the evening, is that actually, you know, the diploma and the things that we learned have opened up doors for both of us, and opened up the careers that followed for both of us in lots of really interesting ways. I think particularly because Human Givens is such a robust but flexible way of approaching the world and approaching therapy. So let's talk a little bit about our key topic for this evening, then, about the Human Givens Diploma. And we'll start really by talking about the Human Givens idea itself, and Human Givens therapy, and what that is. Obviously, people joining this may have come across some of this before. Some of you may be completely new to it. So let's just start right back at the very beginning of the Human Givens journey. And if you follow anything around mental health, if you read around mental health generally, you will see that there are lots of debates and discussions about what is the cause of mental illness, what is it that leads to good mental health. You might see debates about it being a biological condition, or about environmental, or about trauma, or about individual persons' characteristics. And there are many schools of therapy out there, many different schools of therapy and counselling. And a number of years ago, Joe Griffin, Ivan Tyrrell, and a number of other people who were around at the time were kind of debating and discussing this, and trying to work out, well, what is it that underlies all of this? What is going on that's leading to people becoming mentally ill? And why is it that we have so many different ways of looking and thinking about this? Is there a way of bringing all of this together? And so they went back to kind of basic principles, and started thinking right from the very beginning to, well, if you look back at the beginning of every school of therapy, more or less, what was its initial aim? What was it trying to do? And this gets nuanced and more complicated as schools of psychotherapy and counselling grow. But in the very beginning, most therapy schools, movements, start by thinking about, well, there are people who are in distress, and so distressed that it impacts their ability to function day to day and to be able to enjoy fulfilled lives. And the idea of psychotherapy and counselling is to be able to work with the person to help them overcome that distress, so that they're able to live fulfilled lives for themselves. So we need then to think about that and break that down. So let's think about that. So these people who are in distress, well, what do we know about people? So people are human beings. And one of the key things we know about human beings is that human beings are living things. So if we then think about living things and think, well, what is it that we know about living things? Well, what we know about all living things is all living things require nutrition from their environment in order to be able to grow, maintain themselves, reproduce, and thrive. So plants need to be able to draw up water and nutrients from the soil, and they need to be able to take in sunlight for photosynthesis. If they produce flowers, they do that so there need to be insects who can pick up their pollen so that they can pollinate. And these things then help them to grow and reproduce and maintain and thrive. And the same thing is true of all living things. And when living things are unable to meet their needs in a healthy balance, they become distressed. And, the plants in my house sometimes become distressed, and they demonstrate that by showing me brown leaves and dropping off. Human beings, as a more complicated living thing, of course, will express this in different ways. And our needs as human beings are more complicated. And we'll look a little bit more at what those needs might be in a moment. But of course, we have a range of them. We have physical needs. So we know, for instance, that diet and exercise and sunlight and sleep all have really significant impacts on our physical health, but also on our mental health overall. And we also have a whole series of emotional and social needs, and we'll talk about those in a moment in a bit more depth. So we have these needs as human beings, and if we can get them met in a really healthy balance, then we're happy and we can thrive and we can maintain and we can live fulfilled lives. But of course, in order to be able to do that, we must have a way of doing that normally, because people aren't always distressed. This distress doesn't occur all of the time. So we must be able to do this most of the time. So how does that happen? Well, it happens because we as living things have resources. We all living, again, if you think back to the plant we talked about earlier, it has roots to enable it to draw up nutrition and hydration. It has leaves to be able to catch the rays of the sun. It produces flowers to be able to pollinate. And those resources help plants get their needs met. So as human beings, of course, we have resources. We have a digestive system that can eat food, digest it, and take energy and nutrition from that in order to keep our bodies healthy. We are able to take in sunlight through our skin, and that has many health benefits for us as well. But we also produce a whole series of other resources. So things like memory and our ability to think rationally. And again, we'll look at those in a little bit more depth in a little bit later on. So if we're able to use those resources and resources that we develop during the course of our life, things like our family, friends, our skills, our interests, then we can use those to help us get our needs met. So why is it that this sometimes goes wrong? Why is it that we can't always just use those resources to meet our needs? Well, because sometimes there are barriers. Sometimes things get in the way of us being able to meet those needs. And when those barriers come along, they prevent people from being able to meet their needs. And there are a number of ways in which those barriers can do that. So this is the basic idea of behind human givens. This is the basic setup for our human beings, which is that if human beings can use their resources to meet their needs in a healthy balance, they'll be healthy. But sometimes barriers can prevent us from doing so. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So human givens therapy then works off the basis of this organizing idea. Our therapy is all structured around how we help people to use their own resources to meet their needs in a healthy balance. So it's about empowering the individual to be able to meet their needs in their own life so that they can be healthy. And that is then the key aim of that. And as we'll talk about later on, what we then do is we look to lots of other areas for wisdom. So we look to other therapies and some effective techniques that we bring from lots of other different therapies. It's a very pragmatic, multimodal type of therapy. It's a very holistic therapy, human givens. We draw on effective practice from other therapies, from other schools, other areas of healthcare, social care, from philosophy, psychology, and from ancient sources of wisdom as well, to bring together a really holistic model of therapy overall. So let's dig down a little bit more into all of this. So in terms of our emotional needs overall, what do we mean by those needs that we have? So obviously, as I say, we have those physical needs. So what are these emotional needs? Well, we have a need to feel safe and secure. If we don't feel safe in our environment, if we feel that we are under threat, if we are in danger in some way, then that's obviously going to cause us a certain level of distress and put us on a certain level of alert. Now, if that's short term, that'll go away. But if that's continuing over a long period of time, if we're not safe in the home, or we're being bullied in the workplace or at school, or in wider society, if we don't feel safe, then that's going to have an impact on our well-being. We need to have a sense of control over a good portion of our lives. And very often when you're working with people who are unwell or who are very stressed, they'll talk to you about the fact that they feel out of control. And actually, really interestingly, studies of workplace stress quite often show that it's not the size of workload that causes people to feel stressed. It's the not feeling in control of the workload that causes that stress. So we need to feel in control of a good proportion of our life. And we also need to be able to give up elements of control, because we can't control everything in our lives. And if we try to or want to, that can become quite distressing as well. So very often when we're talking about these needs, we talk about balance, and balance is a really important concept in this. Equally, the need for attention is one we need to think about in balance. We do need to receive attention from other people. We need to be noticed. And again, you see this in workplaces quite a lot. quite often annual reviews aren't really so much about what pay am I going to get, but it's about, have I been recognized? Have I been seen? Have I been understood by my manager and by the organization? And we also need to give attention to other people. Focusing out onto other people is actually really good for us. And one of the really interesting things from loneliness research is that the most effective thing that people can do in order to overcome loneliness is actually to help other people, because that focusing out on others lifts us out of that loneliness quite often and helps us to feel better. We have a need for an emotional connection with other people. And again, thinking about loneliness, you can have many people in your life but still feel lonely. The key thing is the quality of the relationships you have. We need one or two other people in our lives to whom we can share our deepest, darkest concerns and worries and secrets. And if we have that kind of secure connection helps us to thrive. But if we don't, we can be more susceptible to loneliness overall. That said, we do also have a need to be part of that wider community. Having more people in your life, being more connected, actually has a really beneficial impact on your physical health as well as on your mental health, and also appears to have an impact on our overall longevity. People who are more socially connected seem to live longer. We have a need for a sense of status. And that isn't about us being on top of any pecking order, on top of a pile, but it's about us being valued, feeling that we're contributing to the world, and that the world in some way recognizes and sees that and values us, that there are some other people in our life who value what we bring to the world overall. And that's linked to the next need, which is that we have a need to feel competent. We need to feel we're good at something. That kind of gives us a sense of confidence and self-worth and self-esteem, that we feel that we can contribute something. It doesn't seem to particularly matter what we're good at. So you might feel really competent in your work, or competent as a parent, or competent academically, or really competent in a hobby. Whatever it is, feeling that you are good at something is really beneficial to your well-being. Speaking of balance, of course, we've talked a lot here about social needs and the need to be connected to other people, but we also, of course, need space. And one of the things that we saw during lockdown, during the pandemic in many countries, was that actually suddenly when people were in cramped accommodation with each other and didn't feel that they could get their own space, that had a really detrimental impact overall on their well-being. And you started seeing lots of articles about how people in spaces where there wasn't much privacy actually were able to get that need met. So submariners talked about being on their bunk with their head down, which meant that no one would disturb them when they were on the submarine, because that was a signal that said, I'm now in my private space. And then finally, we have a need for meaning. We need to feel stretched. We need to feel that there is something purposeful that we're engaged in our lives. And there are a number of ways, three kind of main ways in which we go about doing this. But the important thing is that to get that need for meaning met, it has to stretch you and challenge you in some way. So actually, as human beings, we need to keep growing and keep developing. And hopefully that's one of the things that our students find through the diploma, is that it continues to stretch them in a meaningful and purposeful way, which then helps them to meet their needs. Now, there are many models of needs. You may have seen and come across other models, and Deci and Ryan have a particular model. What you will notice when you look at them all is that they're basically the same. Some have more needs, some have less. They're basically, when you unpack them, they're the same set of needs that come up again and again and again. They just have slightly different wording. They're described in a slightly different way. As an academic who works in universities, I can say this is what happens when you let academics near any subject. We like to complicate it and come up with new terms. But essentially, they boil down to very similar sets of needs. And when we're then able to get those needs met in balance, we can thrive. But in order to do that, of course, we have to use those resources I talked about earlier, in which Joe will talk us through a little bit more now. Oh, you're going to talk about the barriers first, aren't you? Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Joe will talk to you about the barriers that get in the way of that.
Yeah, totally. So Gareth mentioned, when he first started speaking, that there are barriers to people being able to meet their needs, whether that's physical needs or emotional needs. And there's really, three main reasons why people struggle with their mental health. And the first of those is that the environment is sick, that they might be in a toxic environment, and that might be in the workplace, it might be in a relationship, there may be some conditioning, some abuse going on, it might be they're just not very happy where they are. They might be in living in an environment as many people are living in now, where there's huge financial pressures on people, and we're seeing that impact coming through more and more in terms of mental health. So when there's a toxic environment, that can be a barrier for people getting their needs met as well. The next one is damage or disruption to the internal guidance system. So this is where we're all born with a guidance system to help us to navigate the world around us, to navigate that environment. And if this is disrupted in some way, whether that is because we're perhaps not sleeping well, we're perhaps not getting our nutritional needs met well, perhaps there's some genetic or developmental disruption. It might be that there's been some damage through stroke or through brain injury, but also some psychological trauma as well, things like PTSD. And also some faulty conditioning as well. So when that guidance system is disrupted, that can become a barrier as well to people being able to meet those needs in balance. Now, the third one, and this is one when we're talking to students, this is one that can be so easy to overlook, but something that Gareth and I saw time and time again in universities, and that was missing skills. So especially in the world that we inhabit now, we see so much over-parenting. There's an under-parenting in some places, but there's also equally an over-parenting. People wanting to pave the way for their young people so that they don't have to experience any hardship. And the result of that is that we see quite a lot of people coming into university without some of the skills that they need to be able to meet their needs in balance. And this can filter right through, of course. So if you've grown up in a toxic environment, you might not have been able to acquire some of those skills that you need to be able to navigate the world. Things like emotional regulation, so emotional skills as well as intellectual skills, and as well as very practical skills as well. People being able to make themselves a meal, or know how to go and navigate a supermarket. And these might seem very basic, but these are very, very real things that have come into the therapy room for us. Including managing finances as well. Such a huge problem for people at the moment. And I'm a big believer, if they were to teach more of these things in schools, then perhaps we would have less of these problems. So the three main reasons then: environment is sick, disruption to the internal guidance system, and missing skills. They're the three categories that we know that everything pretty much that we've come across in terms of people not being able to meet their needs in balance that leads to mental ill health sit very, very comfortably within these three categories.
So let's talk then about the resources I mentioned earlier, because as I say, people have those needs. There are sometimes barriers that get in the way, but we have resources that we can draw. Now, as I mentioned earlier, people develop life resources during their life, and almost anything can be a resource that helps you get your needs met. But most of us are also born with a set of resources that help us to get those needs met. So we have, for instance, a long-term memory, which is an extraordinary thing if you think about it. We can remember things from our past. We can reconstruct in episodes and things that we've learned in the past. And that then helps us to have a bank of resources that we can draw on when we're encountering new problems and when we're trying to work out how we might meet our needs in a new environment. We can look for things that look familiar. And also, of course, the thing that memory really does is it helps us hold together a story of who we are. It helps us to have an idea that who we are, how we function in the world, how the world works. And that story then helps us to function in the world and to be healthy within it. We also have an imagination, which is an extraordinary thing. I mean, we can imagine things that don't yet exist, and then we can create them. And that, of course, is incredibly useful when we come across new problems where we can't just draw on old solutions that we've already used before. I mean, if you think about the technology that we're talking on tonight, if you think about how comfortable we've all become working on delivering sessions and attending sessions online, which before the pandemic, most of us probably weren't used to, but 20, 30 years ago didn't even exist until someone imagined the possibility. And so that's a huge resource that people can then draw on. Now, of course, one of the things that can happen is that we can sometimes misuse our resources. And sometimes when people are experiencing problems with their mental health, one of the things that happens is that the way that they use the resources actually can contribute to that feeling a little bit worse. So they might, for instance, misuse their imagination. And rather than it being used to solve problems, what actually happens instead is they start imagining all the dire things that are going to happen to them. They start imagining problems which don't yet exist. They start imagining what people think about them that are all negative in ways that actually then impact on their mental health overall. So building the skill to use these resources is an important part of actually being able to meet your needs, which Joe was just talking about. We also have an ability to understand the world through pattern matching, through what we call pattern matching, which is that we can see and recognize patterns in the world. And this means we don't have to stop and work out things each time we see them and come across them. Our brain automatically recognizes a pattern, and we can then respond to that appropriately. If you walk into a chair and there are a whole lot of into a room and there are a whole lot of chairs sitting out, you don't have to sit and think, well, what are those? What is that shape? What might it be? Your brain simply pattern matches to, that's a chair, I can sit in it, and you're able to sit without thinking about it. And this then saves us a huge amount of energy and resource. Now, of course, that can be really helpful, but of course, if we pattern match in a way which is unhelpful, if we, for instance, have a pattern match which says going out after dark is really dangerous, then that can have a really negative impact on our life overall. We also have something called an observing self. So the observing self is our ability to step back into awareness. It's our ability to come out of kind of our everyday trance states, to look at the world more broadly so that we can see the whole of a problem, to see the context in which it sits, to become aware of awareness itself, so that we're not necessarily being sucked into the thing in front of us and are then more able to come up with solutions that are more likely to work. We have an ability to build relationships with other people, and that helps us to meet all of those social needs that we talked about earlier. We can walk into a room and build rapport with people we've only just met for the first time. We have a rational mind, and this allows us to think about our emotional responses and to work out problems in a rational way. But we do also have emotions and instincts. And those emotions, again, are incredibly helpful to us most of the time. When we feel fear and move out of dangerous situations, that is keeping us safe. When we feel joy being around our friends, that motivates us to spend more time with them so that we can get those needs met. So they're really powerful, but again, sometimes can mislead us. They're right a lot of the time, but not always. So Plato used to talk about a chariot with two horses. Our rational mind and our emotions working together can help us to navigate the world that much more. And then finally, we have a brain that dreams. And what that does for us is it allows us to discharge unspent emotions during the day so that we're not carrying them into the next day. It means that when we go to sleep at night, where we might be a little bit upset or a little bit worked up about something, when we wake up the following morning, a lot of that emotional arousal has dropped and gone, and we don't carry it into the following day. And that allows us to constantly refresh and allow those emotions to kind of reduce so that they become more manageable and we can move into the following day. And one of the reasons why when our sleep is disrupted, it can be so much more difficult to manage our emotions overall.
Absolutely.
So,
So,
go on, Jo.
Sorry, guys, just, really before we take some questions on that, just that, the aim of the evening is really to help you to understand a little bit more about human givens. There are some of you on the call this evening who have done some of the courses already, but many of you for whom this is all very, very new. So please feel free to engage with the questions. And although we'd always recommend that you do try before you commit, obviously. So we'd recommend that perhaps starting with one of the online courses if you haven't done any already. But we'd also always recommend taking a course in person, one of the in-person days as well. And there's a really good place to start, actually, would be one of the more foundation level ones, and the one that we would recommend you starting with is the language day. And when we get to the end of the slides, there is actually an offer on those days available for people who are attending the open evening. So please do feel free to ask any questions at this point if you have any. And I think we'll then come on to talk about the structure of the training for the next section.
So one of the things that we have come through in the questions before is that people ask sometimes about the relationship of human givens to other kinds of therapy and other kinds of counselling. And as I said earlier, we draw from quite a number of those schools of therapy and counselling to kind of work within the human givens model. So we draw, for instance, some of the approaches from person-centered counselling. We draw from motivational interviewing, from solution-focused therapy, from CBT. And we bring together a lot of the kind of techniques that come from those other schools of therapy and bring them together in a really holistic way. And the thing that binds them together then is that organizing idea that we were talking about earlier. What we do is we're using those techniques brought together into one model to help people get their needs met overall. We've got a question here from Richard. Maybe I'll throw it to you, Joe. He's asking, is grief an example of disruption, on the slide, on the number 2 slide?
Richard, I think that's an absolutely brilliant question. And I think what I'd say to that is that when somebody's experiencing grief, their environment has changed significantly. So they're experiencing an environment that's very different to what they're used to. And their brain, their internal guidance system, is having to learn new ways to navigate that. So I think it falls into both. That would be my take on it. I think, and I think you find that with a lot of things, they can overlap. Some things can be very, very simple and they can be just one thing, but so many things overlap.
Lovely, thank you, Joe. So we just had another question. Say, Murray, I see you've asked a question about the path towards the diploma. We're going to talk about that in the next section, so we'll cover that in detail. Eamon's just asked about whether we find counselling can be draining hour after hour on a given day. Do you build up resilient stamina, or is it a case of pacing yourself? One of the really nice things about working with human givens therapy is I can honestly say I don't find doing therapy and working with clients draining. Actually, because what most of the time what happens is you have a front row seat at someone's recovery, which is an extraordinary gift, really. It's a privilege, and actually can be quite energizing. And what we try to do is we don't, obviously you need to build rapport with people, and you need to empathize, and you need to be able to understand the emotional experiences they have had. But that doesn't require us to be necessarily calling up lots of our own emotions, because actually that can get in the way of us being able to think clearly as well. And actually what we do is we're trying to free people up and help them to actually be able to use their resources to get their needs met. And very often that then results in people actually starting to find their resources, be able to meet their needs more clearly. And then you see them starting to recover, which is a really great experience to be part of and to be alongside them up until the moment when they're able to say to you, actually, I don't need this anymore. And then we're able to kind of move on from you and go and meet their needs in their own life, which is really what we're aiming for. We're always kind of aiming to put ourselves out of a job with every client we're working with.
Yeah, make yourself redundant. That's the aim. I think the other thing I'd add to that, Eamon, is that we do look specifically on ways that we can prevent that drain that some people might report that they feel as well. So there are very specific ways of working that you can do to protect that yourself from that. But also, as you say, do you build up resilience or stamina? You build up your therapeutic muscle as well. So it might be that you start off, when you start off, you perhaps do a few less sessions than somebody who's been doing it for a while longer.
So the next question we have is that someone said, I get the feeling that other counselling approaches can be quite passive, as HG more proactive and results focused. Joe, we'll throw it to you, but yeah, you're probably going to use our favourite phrase.
Yeah, it depends. We had a group of a cohort of diploma students that actually did a flash mob and took their tops off on the second part of the diploma, and they'd all had these t-shirts made with "It depends" written on them, because it's something that Gareth and I say so often. So there's space for both, and the human givens therapy is tailored to the client. We don't expect the client to fit a particular model. So there might be times when the client does just need to sit and feel heard and have their story heard, but all the while you're going to be really working very hard with the information in that story, and also to what's not being said as well. We've got a structure within human givens that we work through, to keep focused to the session. So all the while you'll be holding that structure in your head, so that you're gaining information that you need to help the client through their goals to the desired outcome. So it can be have times where you're sitting back, you're very much co-creating that session with the client as you go along and tailoring to their needs. Hope that helps.
Richard's other question was about how human givens has developed since it was first created, and so human givens therapy is always moving, because one of the things we try to do is to keep up to date with evidence as it's coming through, and particularly looking at things like neurological evidence and evidence from psychology and so on. So there are always constant, sometimes small changes being made. But equally, one of the things that you'll see if you come through and you do the diploma is on the part 2 of the diploma, which we'll talk about later on. We show some of the videos from very early on when Joe and Ivan were doing therapy, and then you get to see how some of the techniques we're teaching you were originally done and how they've actually changed and grown and developed. And we're able to talk about that and about how it's important that we keep updating our skills, updating our knowledge alongside the evidence that's coming through. Sean's asking, is there a canonic set of therapeutic techniques or processes? Yes, there are. So one of the things that Joe and Ivan did and that we continue to do is to look at what are the evidence-based techniques. What are the techniques that have some really solid evidence behind them, that they really work, and that also fit into the model of helping people to meet their needs overall. So there are some techniques that we know have a reasonable evidence base behind them, but they don't really fit the way that we do therapy. So we're always looking at where's there solid evidence, and then there are also some specific things that we have in human givens which don't necessarily exist in the same way in other therapies. So we have a very specific technique for treating trauma called the rewind technique. We use a technique called counter conditioning. There's another thing called working with molar memory. So there are some things that are very specific to human givens where there were gaps that we were previously in the evidence bases elsewhere, and where we wanted something that worked more quickly. But also we've been very selective on the basis of evidence in terms of what we bring in and how those things work together, because they have to tie together on a model that works overall. In terms of the question about whether human givens works more quickly, I think I'll let Joe in this as well, but we try to make it as brief as possible for the client who is in front of us. So we do want it to be brief, and we do want it to be as quick as possible, because really we want people back out into the world meeting their needs as quickly as possible. And because we're adapting what we do to the client in front of us, quite often that can make it more effective. And then also the techniques that we're using, because they are evidence-based, tend to work quite quickly. So if we can get the selection of the right tools and the right approach for the client in front of us, it can work very quickly. And I think the research that we've done so far is that the vast majority of people get better in about between 3 and 4 sessions. But that's not the case for everyone. Some people will need much longer. So we're not focused on just getting people in and out at some arbitrary quick speed. It's about what's right for the client and their experiences and what the work that they need to get their needs met. I don't know, Joe, if you want to say anything else on that.
Yeah, and I think your point is not to keep somebody in therapy longer than they need to be in therapy, and the whole idea around human givens therapy is helping the client to identify and tap in and add to their resources to overcome the barriers to enable them to meet their needs in balance, so that they can really start to build a life that works for them. And so it's about very much taking what happens in the therapy room outside into the real world, so that they can start putting those things in place for themselves, so that they can really get a sense very, very quickly of achievement, no matter how small that may be.
So he's asking the question about how it sits with other modalities, and I think that probably depends a little bit on the other modality you've been trained in. Some will fit very comfortably and very easily. Some might feel very different. I think it's important to say, though, that if you are going to train as a human givens therapist and you want to offer yourself out as a human givens therapist, it's really important that you're advertising yourself very clearly as that, and not mixing modalities unless you're advertising yourself as someone who is doing that, because people need to be able to consent to what they're doing. So if someone's coming expecting human givens therapy and then you're delivering a different modality, they haven't actually consented to that. So we deal with all this on the course, and we talk you through all of that on the course. But certainly if you want to come and do some of the days, if you're a counsellor or a therapist with another approach, very often we get people coming and just doing some of the days because they find that helpful to add to their toolkit overall.
And I came from a person-centered background, and I hold that some of those things very, very dear in my practice, and so for me it works very well. Although for some person-centered counsellors it might be too directive, but we have plenty of people from different modalities that either just come and do some of the one-day training, but also plenty have come through to do the full diploma as well.
Yeah. I'm aware we want to get on and talk about the diploma itself, so I'll come back and see maybe at the end and pick up some of the other questions that have been asked, and if not, we'll try and get a response out to you later on. But just on Sean's point, whether you need certain levels of qualification, no, that's not something you specifically need, and we'll talk about that a little bit more now. So The diploma itself is the way in which we train human givens psychotherapists, and it's a flexible course, and we teach in a very evidence-led way as well. So Jane mentioned earlier on that one of the things that I've been interested in and that I've studied a lot in the last few years is about what does effective learning and teaching look like, and that's something we try and integrate as into the diploma. So we teach in ways which are evidence-led. Our classrooms are very interactive. We move around in terms of what we do. We give you opportunities to practice your skills, and we do an awful lot of kind of call and response. We encourage debate and conversation in the classroom. And particularly once you go into part 2 and part 3, we spend a lot of time really making sure that people have understood, and we're happy to teach and reteach over and over again, because we know, the building up of knowledge requires pre-knowledge, and sometimes you need to have 2 or 3 goes at something before you really grasp it. And that's just normal for learning. So we deliberately build all of that into the diploma overall.
Mm. And it's really designed to be as flexible as possible, so and as inclusive as possible. So just as we tailor the therapy to the individual, we actually tailor our teaching to the cohort, and it's very much a collaborative classroom space. And the way that the training is designed is that it means that there are some modules that are online. So if you're at a point in your life where perhaps traveling in person wouldn't necessarily be available to you at the moment, if you've new mum or got other caring commitments, it might be that you start with some of the onlines first before you come along to the in-person day. So many of our students have got other responsibilities and are working full-time, so the in-person days as well are structured to be able to fit in with that, so you don't have to necessarily do those in one block. And in fact, as I was saying earlier on, Gareth and I certainly found it quite helpful to have some space in between. But equally, if you did need to for whatever reason do 2 or 3 at a time, then they're structured in a way that you can do that too. So many people find it quite a good way to fit in around other responsibilities. And the way that we teach, sorry Gareth, but the way we teach is we also understand, Gareth and I have a lot of experience within the universities of working with people with specific learning differences, etc. So we are aware of that, and we're very much able to work with that as well. So and any other challenges that people might have across the course of their learner journey.
Yeah, and so we try to teach in as inclusive way as possible, to make the learning as accessible to everyone as possible, and where we need to, we're happy to try and flex wherever we can. In terms of the question about coming from novice through to fully qualified, I was a novice. I had, Joe had already done some person-centered work. I hadn't. I was an art student. I did drama at university, and I'd done a bit of script writing and a bit of stand-up comedy, and then I was working in a hall of residence, and I started from scratch. In a completely new field, in a completely new discipline. And the Human Givens Diploma is designed to guide you through that. That's one of the reasons we teach and reteach. And what we do is we teach on part 1, easier to grasp versions of things. And then we build on that and we nuance it and we help you see the complications in it as we go through, so that by the time you qualify, you're in a completely different place with your understanding. There's some really interesting research in education which suggests that actually, given enough time, everyone would more or less get the same outcomes educationally. The difference really is not particularly to do with intelligence and talent. It's to do with opportunity to engage with the content. And actually, most of our exam results, we know, for instance, A-level results in the UK, the exams that people sit at 18 are far more a marker of socioeconomic status and exposure to education than they are to do with intelligence. So what we do with the diploma is that we deliberately structure it in a way that allows people to learn from scratch, from the basics, building up. If you have done other training before, that might come in useful. You may be able to think about what you've learned before and compare that. And it's not that the part 1 days won't have challenge and interest in them, because they will. But we designed to try and have that whole classroom in mind. And certainly some of the best students we've had come through have been people who have been in completely different fields: business, electricians, working in marketing, lots of different kinds of roles, and have come through and then been really successful students overall. Key to that is the classroom that we have within Human Givens, and we're really keen that the classroom is collaborative and supportive, and not competitive. It's not a place where we're competing with each other and trying to demonstrate how much we know or how good we are. We're trying to support each other's learning. And we would ask you as students to be supportive to your fellow students as well, so that everyone, we know that in collaborative classrooms, everyone learns better because we're able to meet our needs better in that environment, and that frees us up to be able to learn more overall. We do recommend that you try one or two of the courses before you commit overall. That's what I did. I did a couple of courses at the beginning and then thought, yes, I want to do some more of these, and then became convinced that this is absolutely the right thing for me. But rather than committing yourself to the whole thing at once, it's sensible, I think, to try it 1 or 2 days. And that's another one of the ways in which we're really keen to make sure it's flexible and inclusive, and that we're not asking you to commit to something right away if it potentially isn't right for you.
Absolutely. And with the tutors as well, all of the tutors on the diploma, right the way through part 1, 2, and 3, as well as the standalone courses, all experts within their field, still practicing as therapists, but also have an extensive experience of teaching as well. So when they're there, we're on the diploma, we're not trying to catch you out. We're really focused on your learning and supporting you. We really don't mind how many different ways we need to explain something. So we always say if somebody's not got something, that's on us. It really is about supporting your learning and development within that collaborative space.
So we'll come on then and we'll talk a little bit more about how the diploma is structured overall, because there's a kind of unique structure to the way that we do things in Human Givens. And the way to think about this is we work through kind of roughly three sections overall: part 1, part 2, and part 3, which has 2 separate parts to it. So we're going to break those down for you as we talk our way through all of this, and to think about the kind of the support that we're providing you along the way. So I don't know if you want to pick up and just talk about part 1.
So part 1 consists of some online courses that you can take in your own time. You'll have access to those and you can work through those. They consist of some slides and some video footage, and then you'll have some questions that you need to answer as you go along. There's also some in-person attended days, and we run those days in London, Bristol and Leeds. They're key part of the diploma, and you do need to attend all of those and complete all of those online as well before you attend part 2.
The part 2 is 2 weeks. So you would normally come and do 1 week, and then there's like a 5 or 6 week gap usually to allow you to absorb the learning from that first week, and then you come back and you do the second week. And in part 2, what we do is we take everything that you've learned in part 1, we add to it, we add in some more things, but we also help you develop and deepen your understanding of things you've already come across, to help see the nuance and to help you think about actually how you're now going to apply this working with members of the public, when you're working with people one-to-one, someone who you've never met before coming in with a problem you might not have encountered in that before. How would you shape what you've learned around them so you're able to nuance and think about this in a much more in-depth way, and how you're able to develop and refine your skills? It's a really practical 2 weeks. There's lots of skills practice going on. There's lots of opportunities to sharpen up your work and to deepen your understanding overall. And then at the end of all of that, we have the first of our assessments, which is a 2-hour written exam. It's a knowledge-based exam. We will absolutely get you ready for it so that you're going to pass that. As Joe says, that's our responsibility to make sure you get ready for that, and we teach in a way which really prepares you for that really well. It doesn't require you to write any essays. We aren't interested in your grammar. It's a knowledge-based exam. That exam tests your ability to recall the important information that you need as a therapist under a little bit of pressure, because when you're working with a client, you need to be able to call on that information without having to go and look it up. We also will look across the course of that week at other things. So we'll look at the development of your critical thinking and your self-awareness and your therapeutic skills, so that we're confident you're ready as you come out of part 2 to be able to go and work towards your qualification through part 3. And we'll break that down for you in a little moment. It may be that coming out of that, we ask you to go and do a little bit more work on a few things. But generally what happens is people come out of part 2, they're ready at that point to then start working with members of the public on part 3A.
Which of course actually isn't mandatory at all. We have plenty of people who come through the diploma and use it in lots of different arenas as well. So just because you come on the diploma, you don't the part 2, it doesn't mean that you have to go on to the part 3 at all. Lots of people using it in education and business and healthcare as well. But if you do choose to work towards part 3, then you'll be working very closely with a supervising tutor. So you'll work towards refining the skills that you've learnt on the part 2, and you'll also be starting to work with some clients. And you'll be working with mild to moderate anxiety and depression, and also perhaps some phobias as well. So as you're working with those, you'll be working with your supervisor on a ratio of 1 supervision session to every 8 therapy sessions that you're doing with the clients that you're working with. And your supervisor will work closely with you both on the case studies that the clients that you're seeing, but also on developing those skills as well that you need to develop. There'll be, you can always check out with them the suitability of clients, and that's something that I would say was really important to do as well. And if there comes a point where you think, oh, I'm not really sure about this, they'll be able to support you if it's necessary to refer that client on as well. So it's a very supportive process. Now, some people, I often get asked, how long does it take to get from part 2 to part 3? And again, I trot out the standard, mine and Gareth's favourite phrase is, it depends. So it really depends on how much experience you've had before. So if you're somebody who is, is an experienced therapist, perhaps in another modality, then, you might move through that process a little bit quicker. But on average, people can take, a year to do it, but they could take 6 months to do it. But we do say that you've got up to 2 years to move through that journey. So there's no pressure to complete that in a particular time. And it does take time. The more mileage you can have of that practice, the more you're able to hone those therapeutic skills and that understanding. And it's something that when you're working with your supervisor, they'll be checking out and having open discussions with you about your preparedness for part 3, and it certainly wouldn't be something that you'd be moving on towards until both you and your supervisor felt that you were really ready for that.
So that leads us then to part 3, and so part 3 is another week-long course. And there are a number of things that happen on that. So first of all, your learning continues to happen. That continues to be a teaching week, and your learning will deepen, and you will go away at the end of that week a better, more informed, more rounded, nuanced therapist than at the beginning of the week. And that's certainly been our experience at working with students. But also on part 3, we are doing some key assessments. Now, within the college, we operate what's called authentic assessment. What that means is we are interested in assessing the key skills that you need to have to be a therapist. So we don't assess by essay or written report or anything like that. What we need to see is that you can deliver safe, effective, ethically sound therapy. So what we ask you to do on that week is we ask you to deliver 2 therapy sessions with a client. You won't know what's coming in the door, you won't know what you're about to work with, and we will observe that therapy and assess how you respond to that client and what comes in, to make sure that you're able to do that. There is also a viva. A viva is where you come and you present an idea, and what we're asking you to talk about is how you might use the Human Givens idea in an area other than psychotherapy and counselling. And that's so that we can really test that you've really understood the Human Givens organising idea, and you've really got a firm hold on it and can see how it might apply elsewhere. And you present the idea for 5 minutes, and then you have basically a half an hour conversation with the tutor where they ask you questions and talk about that idea and are just really trying to understand what you're presenting, but also that you really understand the idea overall. And then at the end of the week, we will ask you to go away and do a reflective piece of work where you reflect on your development so far, where you think you're strong, where you think you're weak, and to plan for your development over the next year to continue your learning. Because it's really important, once you qualify as a therapist, your learning does not stop. It cannot stop. You have to keep stretching and developing yourself. So we look to see what your learning is going to be how you're going to apply that and increase that learning over the course of the next year. When you pass that, then you're able to apply to become a registered human givens therapist. You can register with the Human Givens Institute. That's another piece of just an application you have to do to make all of that happen. The Human Givens Institute is registers accredited by the Professional Standards Agency. That's the same agency that registers BSCP and NCS and BPS and all of the other kind of counselling and psychotherapy registers that you may have heard of in the UK. They're all registered. That's the kind of the government body that then accredits and oversees all of those other registers. So we are a register on the same level as all of those.
So once you have qualified, as Gareth said, that learning continues, and there is an expectation of CPD for all therapists and supervisors. And there's lots of pathways that open up. So you might choose to go and specialise in a particular area, such as working with couples, or perhaps in grief counselling. So there are some specialisms that you can look at further down the line as well. And as well as that, we've got peer groups. So you'll continue to work with your supervisor, and you'll work with them on a ratio of 1 supervision session to every 15 for the first 150 hours post qualification, and then beyond that it starts to taper off as your experience grows. But we've also got what we call peer groups. So these are groups that meet in person and online. So you've got a choice of which peer groups that you attend, and they might meet, for example, once a month, and it's a space for you to discuss your practice in a more informal but led environment, if you like, and then those peer groups tend to be led by people who have been working as human givens therapists for quite a while. So often as well, people make friends for life on the training. So we quite often see, Gareth and I, have been friends since we did our training. So, we often see groups of people coming through that they keep their little WhatsApp groups, going, and it really is nice to see that community as it builds.
So obviously, one of the things the course does is it will allow you to qualify, and it would allow you then to practice as a practitioner on an accredited register. But it brings a huge amount of other learning. And Joe and I talked earlier on about the fact that when we were learning, it felt like our minds were kind of expanding and our brains were exploding on a day-to-day basis. But it does enrich your knowledge overall, and it allows you to look at the world in a different way. It allows you to think about and understand things in a different way, and it gives you a framework that allows you to work. I mean, certainly a lot of the work that I've done would not have been possible if I hadn't done the training that I did within Human Givens. It opened up a way of thinking about the world, of critiquing the world, and that learning then has led to a lot of the other work that I've been able to do. And to understand the ways in which actually things we can do to help people thrive, whether that's through therapy or whether you're thinking about this in a whole range of different contexts. As I said, the work that I do now is largely around how we make mental health and wellbeing better in our universities, particularly in the UK, although I work with colleagues internationally on that as well. And the Human Givens idea is one which helps me to think about how do we organize our universities? How do we teach in a different way? How do we help people to socially interact within universities in a different way? How do we structure the way we do staff training? All of those kinds of things. It opens up a ways of thinking about and exploring all of those things to think about how we can help create environments in which people can thrive overall. I would say from my own practice, it's a gift being a Human Givens therapist, because you are very often working with people and seeing them get better and seeing the work that you're doing actually having a really positive impact, which is really encouraging. The skills and the techniques that we teach, they do have a really solid evidence base behind them, and we know that they are effective when we can see the impact that has. And certainly the research that we've done on Human Givens therapy so far does seem to indicate that with a very broad range of people, it does seem to work for most people. No therapy works for everyone, but it does seem to work for everyone. We'll take questions when we get to the end of this section, Sean, if that's okay. So it does seem to work for a very broad range of people, and it allows you to work with a very wide range of difficulties as well. So although when you're a student, you'll be working with mild to moderate presentations, many of us work with many more significant presentations as well. There's an organization called PTSD Resolution, who largely work with military veterans with PTSD and other complicating factors going on, so maybe addiction, things like that alongside it. And they're getting fantastic results with the clients that they're working with in quite relatively short spaces of time compared to what you would normally expect. So it does open up ways of working with people in all kinds of ways and with all kinds of presentations.
Absolutely. And I think, because of the way, we teach in a jargon-free way, which makes it really accessible for people who are just starting out in therapy, or maybe even coming from, a different modality. So, it's highly suitable for professionals who are wanting a career change, for example, because I think, the way that the teaching is structured and the language that we use to teach is human language rather than anything, jargonistic. So it really does bring a lot of clarity to what can be sometimes very complicated arguments that can happen within the world of therapy. So we've had people, I was just thinking back today, and the people that we had on our last appointment, we had people from education, police, we had people from the armed forces and the NHS. We had a dancer, we had people from the performing arts as well as the fitness industry. We also had people from charity backgrounds. We had an accountant, which was nice for me. And we had, but not necessarily for Gareth, but we had wellness industry students as well as a social worker. And we had an estate agent as well, actually. And we often get full-time working parents, and it always intrigues me. So I was a full-time parent when, sorry, not full-time working parent, but if I was a full-time parent when I did my training, and I remember coming in feeling this huge sense of what would be commonly called imposter syndrome, as I was sitting next to a psychiatrist, and I thought, oh my goodness, what on earth am I doing here? And actually, I had no prior knowledge of human givens, but neither did he, and actually we were kind of starting from the same place, but maybe he had some stuff that he needed to get out of the way, and I had some stuff that I needed to get out of the way. And the way that the language that we use in human givens made that really, really easy to do, actually.
And I think that is a really important part of this, going back to the point earlier on about the people being able to come from novice or from other experience that you might already have had, is that again we deliberately design our teaching in that way to try and make it as inclusive and as accessible as possible for everyone. And that's partly also about the way in which we design our part one, that it's very flexible, that you can choose when and as and when you do the course, and the length of time it needs for you to work across all of that. I think one of the things that happens through all of that as well is, of course, people develop their own personal insight. And it's really interesting the ways in which people develop over the course of this, and the way in which actually they're able to start looking after their own well-being a little bit better. And sometimes the way that flows out beneficially into other relationships that they have and the families that they have, and also into their workplaces. And sometimes what happens is people, we've had people coming and working who are already in healthcare roles, for instance, come and do the diploma, and then stay within the healthcare role they were already in, but using the skills that they've built up. We've had some midwives, for instance, who have come in and done the human givens qualification, and that's changed the way in which they're working with the new parents that they're working with, or so people working as health visitors and using the skills in a different way, so we can make you more effective in that existing role. And certainly for me, working within the university sector, it's made my role really much more effective in what I was doing than if I hadn't done this qualification.
And I think it's when I qualified, I went and set up in private practice, which was something that I could do just very gently, build up around my children. And some people go and work full time, but others prefer to have it as a secondary income. We have plenty of people who are working full time whilst they're doing the training, and they continue in their day job. But this is something that they're wanting to bring in, as either as a second income, or perhaps they're looking to gently transition from one career to another. So it's it is really flexible, and we've had people that have moved out of one thing into another. Perhaps they've gone into full-time into private practice, but we've had people that have come on and then gone and had developed roles within the NHS, within as in school counselling services, obviously for us within universities, plenty of people in colleges as well. We have people who work in prisons, within charities, also offering specialist support. So I noticed that one of the questions this evening was around how suitable is it for working with neurodiversity. We have a number of people who work specifically with neurodiverse clients and offer that as a support, as a support role for people with neurodiversity, and also offering specialist, consultancy or support, or therapeutic services to specific industries. So perhaps they've come from law, or perhaps they've come from a business background, and then they take that in as I have an understanding of your world, and this is what I can bring in to support you.
Yeah, absolutely. And along with that career flexibility, then obviously, as we talked earlier on, there is a professional accreditation. So this is an award and a role which is accredited, as we say, by the Professional Standards Authority, so that actually, when clients come to see you, they can trust that you've had the proper training, that you've been properly supervised, that you know what you're doing, and that you are going to be safe, effective, and ethically sound because you've been trained and assessed to be as such. And the PSA oversees our work, and we have to kind of respond to them every year to demonstrate that we are doing things in a way which is appropriate and up to standard. And then the other thing which has come along in the last few years is something some of you may have heard about, and we certainly had questions in advance of this, which is something called the Scoped Framework, or the Scope-Ed framework, depending on how you want to pronounce it. This is a framework that's been put together in the UK by the 6 large main counselling and psychotherapy registers and organisations. So you may have heard, for instance, BSCP is the one people most have usually heard of, the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists. And we are part of that. Human Givens Institute is part of that. We're one of the 6 partners. And what we've done is we've worked together to set out the kind of competencies and standards that we would expect counsellors and psychotherapists to have at different stages in their career, as they gain experience. And sometimes training takes some people onto one of those columns, onto one of those areas. So basically the framework is split into 3 columns: column A, B, and C. Column A is the starting point, and it's the starting point for registered counsellors with BICP, and it's the starting point for our registered members in Human Givens. And essentially, if I just show you our next little slide, I'll come on to that one in a moment. Let's come on to this. So what happens is, as you come out of part 3, you get the Human Givens Diploma, you're a registered member, and you begin in column A, and this is our starting point. As you build your practice, as you build your experience, and as you continue to do that CPD, that ongoing development that we talked about, and you work with your supervisor, there is then a route through that we're actually just implementing at the moment, which will then allow you to become an accredited member of the Human Givens Institute, which then matches to column B of the Scope Framework and is equivalent to accredited membership of BSCP, for those of you who know that. That's generally when large organizations like the NHS are looking for counsellors and psychotherapists, they quite often look to that column. And that also then allows you to become a supervisor, potentially, and to work towards column C, which is the kind of leadership end of the column. Not that most counsellors and psychotherapists don't go towards that, but that's for kind of people who end up leading services or leading practice in some way. So when you come into Human Givens, you would do the diploma, you qualify as a new member, you build your practice, you build your ongoing CPD and your ongoing learning and training, and then in time you would move to become an accredited member, which, as I say, is equivalent to accredited membership for a number of those other bodies. And that's one of the advantages that you would then have. As I said, this is the kind of the recognised national training framework that's now going to be in place within the UK. It's now being recognised broadly across the UK. And doing this training puts you into that framework and puts you onto that those recognised columns that will be known across the kind of the counselling and health sectors. So let me just check where I am. And I think the other thing just to say is that we know that people go on to many very different careers. There are also a number of Human Givens centres. There's one in York, there's one in Dublin. I think there's 1 or 2 others that people are talking about setting up at the moment. And there are also increasingly other employers who are recognising Human Givens and recognising the value and benefit of it. Certainly within the university sector where I'm working, that's happening more and more. Yeah. So I think we are more or less ready to come on to questions, unless Joe, you had anything else you wanted to say?
No.
So just to say, as we come on to those final questions, that Joe mentioned at the very beginning that there is an offer for this evening, 10% off any attended workshop of your choice. If you haven't done one before, it is a really good idea to try out one or two, and it may be useful for you to use that offer to enable you to do that. But let's look back. We've had some questions pop up into the chat, I'm aware, as we were working our way through that. So I'll work my way backwards, but if you have any other questions, pop them in and Joe and I will pick them up right now. So in terms of Sean Rand's, your question, are there any requirements for personal therapy during the course? I'll start with this, and then Joe, you may want to pick up. So essentially what we said within Human Givens is we don't mandate personal therapy. But if, as you're going through the training, it becomes clear that there are things that you do need to work on, what we would call animals, things that cause an emotional response and reaction in you, then it is ethically really important that you do go and get therapy to work on those. So if you need therapy, it's ethically, you absolutely should. If you don't need to. So we don't mandate a set number of hours. We don't say you have to go and do it, because if there isn't something that you need to work on, therapy, like any other medical treatment, it's not a no risk treatment. There are risks with any therapy or any counselling that you might do, and we want to minimize and reduce those as much as possible. We don't, put in other kinds of medical interventions unless they're absolutely necessary, and we feel that should be the same with counselling and psychotherapy. So if you don't need it, you don't have to. But if things come up for you, it's really important you do go and work with them, because you don't want them cropping up and getting in the way when you're working with clients, because that would be unfair to your client. I don't know, Joe, if you want to add anything more to that.
No, I think that you've covered that. Only I probably will say no. I'm going to talk now. If it does, if something does come up for you, and we talked through this on part 1 and part 2 as well, and also on part 3, but particularly really on part 2, that when we talk about animals and things that you might have your own pattern match to. If there is a suggestion from a tutor that, if we can see that something, or you've perhaps come and told us that you found something particularly difficult, if there is a recommendation from a tutor that you perhaps go and speak to somebody and to do a little bit of work on that, it isn't a criticism and it's not a judgment. It's that ethical, responsibility that Gareth was talking about, and actually it's to help you to develop, both personally and professionally as well, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and absolutely nobody is immune.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that. So Eamon Murphy asked, after part 2, would you need to give up the day job and commit to it? Not necessarily. I mean, as we said earlier, people take different lengths of time to do this. Certainly Joe and I both worked during that period, because giving up and just committing to it completely wasn't really an option for either of us at that point. So this is one of the ways in which we talk about, we try to make this as flexible and as inclusive as possible. We don't want to set barriers in people's way by saying, right, at this point, you now have to give up everything else in your life and focus on this. What you would do is you would work with your supervisor to identify what was an appropriate way to make sure that you were progressing at a reasonable rate within the life that you have to live, because you will have responsibilities, you'll have other people in your life, you'll have jobs and money, we all need to be bringing in money and things like that. So we absolutely will not be requiring you, and the course doesn't require you to give up. It is possible to make the course work around your life, and we try and put in the flexibility to make sure that happens, because that's really important to us, that we're not putting barriers in people's way. Otherwise you just get counsellors coming from backgrounds who can afford to kind of give up work in order to train, and that's not helpful for the field as a whole, I think.
Something from Leslie that's just come in. Do you give guidance on client contracts and clients who it may be not suitable for you to work within the training? Yes, we do, Leslie. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I'll pick up one more question from up above, and then I'm aware, Sean Watling, you've had your hand up for a moment. So let me pick this one up, and then we'll pick up the questions that have come in since we finished just presenting. So Richard's asking, I'll throw this one to you, Joe, about, I think this is in relation to people that you can work with between part 2 and part 3. Could that practice include bereavement?
Okay. Again, it would depend. So we would say bereavement can be something that's quite complex, and it might not be something that, if you're just starting out, is necessarily appropriate to work with. There is a separate a course to do on working with grief that happens post part 2. But if it's something that you're already working with, and we'd say this not just for bereavement, but if you're already working with children, then it might be appropriate for you to work with children. If you're already working with certain presentations that we might say are best avoided, if you're already very familiar with that arena, then yes, but again, that's on a case-by-case basis, and that will be for individual discussion between the trainee and the tutors.
Yeah, thank you. Shari, just on the question, will the therapeutic power of language course count towards the diploma? Yes, it does. It's one of the in-person courses that you have to do as part of part one. So yes, if you attend that, you would potentially be covering part of the diploma if you decided to continue with that. Yeah. Just to go back to Robert, you're asking about where the stages of the course map onto the scoped columns. The complete diploma, once you've registered with the Human Givens Institute as a practitioner, puts you onto column A of the scoped framework. And then as you develop as a practitioner post-qualification, you would then be able to apply to move to accredited membership, which is column B. So I hope that clarifies all of that. So in terms of credentials being recognized outside of the UK, that varies and it's complicated. It's also more complicated in the United States, Christopher, because it's you have to be recognized state by state in the United States. So generally in the UK and Ireland, Human Givens is recognized. There are practitioners in the Netherlands. We have quite a community of Human Givens practitioners in the Netherlands. But it's probably best that we have individual conversations with people about what we know about your area and what can be done there. Yeah. So I'm just looking through here to see. I'm aware, Sean, I don't know, Sean Watling, you did have your hand up. I don't know if you still have a question you want to ask. No? Okay. And I don't know if I'm
about part one courses. Since there are more part one courses than the mandatory amount, does that mean you can choose to an extent which courses you do? And no, the courses are set out within that diploma journey graphic that we can get sent through to you. So there are specific courses that take that fit into the part one that you need to do. Any of the other standalone courses you can do with CPD. I hope that helps. Sarah, just to clarify, once you're on column B, you can become accredited through other bodies such as the BACP. No, but it's the equivalent of. So the column B is column B, and it's column B for everybody. So if you're column B BACP and you're column B HGI, it is the equivalent level of accreditation.
I should just say on that, because sometimes people do get confused, but this BACP are not the registering body for counsellors in psychotherapy, and I'm not. My BACP colleagues say this themselves, so I'm not saying anything detrimental here. There are a number of accrediting bodies in the UK. The BACP are one, and they're the largest, so they're the one people tend to have heard of. But there are, as I say, there are 6 partners who are all registering bodies. We all do the same thing. We're all equivalent level, and what the scoped framework is doing is helping people to see that. So if you are on column B with HGI, you're exactly the same as on column B of BACP. It's recognized externally as the same thing. Murray, do you have your hand up?
For the last little bit, I've been looking through the courses online. I'm trying to determine whether or not it's possible to do this, because I'm from Canada, whether or not it's possible to do this out of UK, or if I actually have to go to Britain and put some time in.
Yeah, so we do as much of it online as is possible, but there are some courses you just have to be there in the UK for, because you have to be able to develop your skills, you have to be able to work with people, and we have to be able to see you do all of that. And so it's like, you can't do online surgery training, so equally you can't do online therapy training. You have to actually be in person to do some of that work. So it would require you to be in the UK to do some of it, because we don't have courses running in Canada, I'm afraid. I'd love to have, but unfortunately we don't at the moment.
Is there a way to get a breakdown of what needs to be done, like in UK versus what can be done remotely?
There is, absolutely. So let me just work my way back to the diploma journey slide. So yes, absolutely. If you look at this is all online on our website, and you can see that there are a number of the part ones that are online, and then there are a number that are day attendance courses. We try to do batches of three of those days together so that people can come in and do them together in batches. We find any more than that, and people actually start forgetting what they're learning. And then the part 2 and part 3 are all in person. So you can see on the list down there what's online and where it says 1 day or 2 day. Those are in person days.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And part 2 and part 3 are obviously in person as well, aren't they, Gareth? And
yeah, they are. Yeah.
Just to be clear, because I can see that there's a question about the costing there. You've got the different costs on this diagram here. We will be sending out links to this after the event. And we do various offers and things on part 1 online courses and things, so do look out for those. So that does reduce the cost, but we do need to point out that when you're working between part 2 and part 3, you do need to pay for your supervision, pay for membership of the HGI as well. And so that there are additional costs there that vary depending on your previous experience, how long that stage of the diploma takes you, and so forth. So that's very hard for us to estimate. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think supervisor tutors tend to charge about £50 to £85 a session, something like that, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they keep it as low as possible for students.
The other cost there, Jane, is also for insurance. I know somebody was asking about insurance earlier. So you would need to register with an insurance company as a trainee human givens therapist, but we give you all of those details on part 2. It really is relatively cheap. I'm not sure what it is for trainees, but for fully qualified, I think, Gareth, how much do we pay a year?
I've just done mine and it went up a little bit, so I think mine was about 120. So, but I also have one of the more expensive insurance companies.
Yeah, but I, the last, it was a while ago that I was a trainee, but I know that the cost was I found was really quite reasonable. So, but you would need to register, and we can give you the details of the insurance companies that we know that do that very, very easily. I've just seen something about online as well. No, all clients would need to be really seen face to face, because there are certain things that you wouldn't be qualified to do online at that stage between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Can you start charging for clients when working between part 2 and part 3? We would highly recommend that you didn't, because you're not actually a qualified therapist at that point. Unless you already are, of course, but we would still recommend separating those two things out.
I think aren't there some exceptions that if you're hiring a room that you can pass on the room charges? Is that right? Yeah. So we'd be pragmatic about that, but it's
cover the
cost.
Yeah. But again, and I think it's like anything really, it's about being really clear and upfront. That you are a trainee and you're not charging for the counselling, but you are taking a contribution towards the hire of the room.
I think
I was just going to say the one more thing that I really would recommend, actually, because the journey can be a bit complicated. I see there are a few questions have been coming through about, I didn't quite know how to go through the thing. Do feel free to call the office and chat to my colleague Fiona Heffernan, who is the main sort of linchpin, chatting with the diploma students, talking them through their journeys, and we're very happy to chat you through, work out a pathway, the courses you might want to start with, and just if you just want to try. But it's great for us to know if you are thinking of doing the diploma, and we can support you as best we can, recommend a good time to go through, which courses to map out for you. So she's very happy to do that and answer any questions that you might have after today.
Richard just asked about placements for practice clients, and how does that work? So there are some places that do placements, so that it depends where you are in the country, if you're in the UK or where you are externally to the UK. So in terms of where you might need to work to find your clients, or where there actually are places that will give you placements. So when you're doing the diploma, we can have more of a conversation with you about those places that do offer, that are happy to take human givens therapists for placement. But generally, our students do find places where they can work with clients, and they do find placements where that's the appropriate thing. But we can talk you through all of that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Somebody mentioned earlier that they thought it sounded as if it sounded quite similar to coaching, or was it a good match for coaching? I can't remember specifically what it was, but we do have a number of people who come from a coaching background into Human Given's way of working therapeutically, because there are some similarities, but it is very much a therapeutic skill. Rather than the coaching skill. But that's not to say that you can't do the part 2 and really enhance your coaching practice if that's what you choose to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we've had several people do that actually, haven't we?
We have, yeah. So just before we round off the evening, does anybody have anything else, final questions they want to ask before I let you all go back into your evenings or wherever you are in the world? I'm seeing nothing else coming through. Okay. All right, Jean, I don't know if you want to...
I was just going to say a huge thank you to you both. I don't know if you can put the special offer slide back up to remind everybody, but I will be sending that out to everybody. So if you do decide you want to try another course or to try your first course with us, we'd love to see you. And we've got these special offers here. As I say, 10% off any of the attended workshops that you decide to do. And a really good one is Gareth. He's got a couple in Leeds. You're in Leeds next week, aren't you, Gareth?
I am.
Doing therapeutic language and stories, how to tell stories at Hill, which are fantastically entertaining days, I understand. And then we've already got 15% off our online courses at the moment, but if you use that code HGDP15, you can get an extra 15% off, so it'll be 30% off a course you fancy trying. And we've also got our bundle offer, which is there pretty much all the time. If you know it's for you, you can buy all 8 at once to save 20% on everything. So we would love to see you if you haven't already come to do some of our training. And like I say, do call the office if you think of any other questions that we haven't answered tonight. We're always happy to answer any questions you might have. Do get in touch. But I don't know if the two of you would like to say anything else. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you both for sparing us your time this evening and giving a very great run through of the diploma, and hopefully everybody's got a really good feel for the way we teach, how we approach therapy, and what we do. So I can't see any more questions coming in, so I think that's probably it now. We're a little bit early, unless there's anything else you two would like to say to sign off.
Just to thank you to everyone for coming along this evening, and we look forward to seeing some of you in the future on some of the courses. And when you do feel free to come and say hello in the breaks and stuff as well. Yes, I look forward to seeing you and learning more. So thank you all very much.
It's really exciting because there are already people putting in the comments that they're signed up, they're coming to some courses. So yeah, very much looking forward to meeting you.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone.
And
Thanks,
on that
everybody.
note,
2 minutes past 8, so we'll wrap up. But thank you everybody for joining us, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.